In 2014, Disney looked at 40 years of Star Wars storytelling. The Yuzon Vong invasion, Jacen Solo's fall to the dark side, the Abeloth crisis, and declared it didn't happen. But here's what they didn't count on. The fans decided Disney doesn't get to make that call. The expanded universe represents the legitimate continuation of Star Wars. And the fandom's rejection of Disney's Legends rebranding isn't nostalgia. It's quality control from an audience that watched a corporation delete superior storytelling to replace it with the sequel trilogy. The sheer scale of what existed before the corporate axe fell was unprecedented in modern fiction. Alan Dean Foster's Splinter of the Mind's Eye hit shelves in 1978. A slim paperback originally conceived as a low-budget sequel contingency in case the first film flopped. The film didn't flop. What followed was one of the most extraordinary experiments in collaborative fiction ever attempted. Hundreds of authors, artists, and game designers built an interlocking narrative tapestry spanning roughly 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin to 140 years after it. By the time that experiment was forcibly terminated, the expanded universe comprised thousands of pages of novels, hundreds of comic book issues published primarily through Dark Horse Comics, and multiple video game narratives, all operating within a shared continuity overseen by Lucasfilm's own internal database. Lucasfilm's internal continuity database was the engine behind that coherence, overseeing shared continuity across hundreds of publications and multiple decades of storytelling. This wasn't fan fiction. It was a managed literary ecosystem with institutional oversight. The real ignition point came in May 1991. Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire landed on bookshelves and reinvented Star Wars as a living literary franchise. Zahn introduced Grand Admiral Thrawn, the cold, calculating Imperial strategist who studied his enemy's art to predict their tactics. He introduced Mara Jade, the former Emperor's hand who'd eventually become Luke Skywalker's wife and one of the most beloved original characters in the entire franchise. Buried within the diplomatic intrigue and military campaigns of the Thrawn trilogy was a quieter detail that would reverberate for decades. Leia Organa Solo was pregnant with twins. Jacen and Jaina Solo were born in the trilogy's conclusion, The Last Command, published in 1993. Jacen arrived in 9 ABY, 5 minutes before his sister. An innocuous narrative beat at the time. Nobody could have predicted that his life, stretching from that moment across nearly 2 decades of real-world publishing, would become the single most compelling argument against everything Disney later did to this franchise. Zahn's trilogy didn't just launch a publishing phenomenon. It created a template for how the EU would operate. Other authors built on his foundation. Hundreds of creators, novelists, comic book artists, game designers, constructed narratives that extended far beyond the Skywalker Solo dynasty. The EU was deep enough to sustain characters who existed entirely outside the main saga's gravitational pull. Video games pushed the boundaries even further, building their own mythologies within the shared timeline. All of it interconnected, all of it maintained, all of it declared legends on a single April day. The post-Return of the Jedi era that the EU constructed looked nothing like the clean reset Disney's sequel trilogy delivered. A rebel alliance trying to transform itself into a legitimate government, while Imperial remnant forces fought a grinding rearguard action across the Outer Rim. That was the political landscape. Luke Skywalker established a new Jedi Academy on the jungle moon of Yavin 4, wrestling with how to rebuild an order that had catastrophically failed once before. Han and Leia navigated the impossible tension between military heroism and political leadership, raising their children, Jacen, Jaina, and later Anakin Solo, in a galaxy that was rebuilding, but never truly at peace. Fans who picked up Heir to the Empire as teenagers in 1991 were reading Fate of the Jedi as adults in their 30s, having grown up alongside these characters. That was the answer to the question viewers still ask: what actually happened after the Ewok Party? The EU built an entire civilization's worth of storytelling around that question, and millions of readers followed every step. Then, on October 30th, 2012, the Walt Disney Company acquired Lucasfilm Limited for $4.05 billion. A sequel trilogy was immediately greenlit, Episode 7 targeted for 2015. For the expanded universe community, the acquisition triggered one existential question. What happens to the continuity? Decades of interconnected storytelling occupied the post-Return of the Jedi timeline, and the new films would need that same narrative real estate. Optimists hoped for adaptation. Maybe the Thrawn trilogy translated to screen. Maybe the Solo twins anchored the new saga. Pessimists braced for a clean slate. For 17 months, the community waited, scanning every interview, parsing every press release for signals. The signal came as a guillotine. April 25, 2014. 2 years and nearly 6 months after the acquisition, a gap that underscores the premeditated nature of the decision, Lucasfilm announced that the expanded universe was being rebranded under a new label, Legends. Going forward, only the 6 theatrical films and the Clone Wars animated series would constitute official Star Wars canon. Everything else, every novel, every comic, every game narrative stretching from 1978 to 2014, was reclassified. The press release gestured toward respect, noting that several characters and vehicles introduced in the EU had already formed part of Star Wars' cultural fabric. The underlying message was unmistakable. None of it counted anymore. Disney had convened a story group at Lucasfilm to manage canon going forward, and that group determined a clean slate served the new trilogy's creative needs better than inheriting 4 decades of continuity obligations. J.J. Abrams and his collaborators wanted creative freedom. The EU's post-Endor timeline was densely populated. Han and Leia married with 3 children, Luke married to Mara Jade, the New Republic reshaped by multiple galactic crises, the Jedi Order rebuilt from scratch. Honoring all of this while remaining accessible to general audiences would have been a monumental challenge. So they wiped the slate. Millions of invested readers experienced the announcement as erasure, a corporation telling them the books on their shelves had been officially downgraded to someone else's fanfiction. What made the timing particularly savage was the state of the EU at the moment the axe fell. Fate of the Jedi had concluded just 2 years earlier, with significant narrative threads left deliberately unresolved. Troy Denning's Crucible, published in 2013, the last novel to feature Luke, Han, and Leia within the Legends timeline, wasn't a farewell. Stories were being planned. Authors were under contract. The community was actively engaged with ongoing narratives. The EU wasn't winding down. It was mid-sentence. And the scale of what was amputated spanned 37 years of interconnected storytelling. Every literary tradition has weak entries. The Crystal Star remains a perpetual punchline. But you don't burn a library because a few books are bad. The EU's peaks were some of the most ambitious long-form storytelling in popular fiction, and 3 arcs in particular stand as prosecutorial exhibits against the decision to bury them. Jacen Solo's story is the crown jewel, and it demands to be understood in full because nothing Disney has produced since comes close. Jacen was a presence in the EU before he drew his first breath, felt through Leia's pregnancy in Heir to the Empire in May 1991. Through Kevin J. Anderson's Young Jedi Knights series in the mid-1990s, readers met him as a teenager. Animal-loving, philosophically inclined. He'd rather commune with creatures through the Force than swing a lightsaber. Gentler than his adventurous sister Jaina, gentler than his gifted younger brother Anakin. Readers who picked up those books as young teenagers were growing up alongside him, matching age for age, year for year. Then came the Yuzon Vong War. Everything changed. The New Jedi Order series ran from 1999 to 2003 across 19 interconnected novels, a galaxy-spanning invasion by an extragalactic species that existed outside the Force, whose biotechnology and religious fanaticism made them unlike any threat Star Wars had ever faced. R.A. Salvatore's Vector Prime opened the series by killing Chewbacca, crushed by a moon crashing into the planet Cernpadal while he ensured Anakin Solo escaped. Fan reaction ranged from devastation to fury. but the death established the rules. This was a story willing to wound its audience because the wounds served the narrative. For Jacen, the war was a crucible in the most literal sense. Captured by the Yuzon Vong, subjected to prolonged captivity and torture, an ordeal chronicled most powerfully in Matthew Stover's Traitor, widely considered one of the finest Star Wars novels ever written. Stover took Jacen into a philosophical abyss, stripping away his certainties about the Force, about good and evil, about existence itself. He emerged transformed. Then, Troy Denning's Star by Star killed Jacen's younger brother Anakin during a strike mission against the Vong in 2001. The boy who loved animals and philosophy had watched his galaxy invaded, been tortured by its conquerors, lost his brother, and stared into a void with no simple answers. Seeds of his fall, planted through accumulated trauma across years of storytelling. No shortcuts, no montages, just the slow accretion of damage that makes a person capable of terrible things. The fall itself came in Legacy of the Force, 9 novels published from 2006 to 2008 by Aaron Alston, Karen Travis, and Troy Denning. 15 years of publishing, harvested. Every relationship, every wound, every unanswered question brought to its terrible conclusion. Jacen Solo, the gentle boy who talked to animals, became Darth Caedus. The transformation unfolded gradually, granularly, with a plausibility that made it all the more horrifying. He convinced himself the galaxy demanded a strong hand, rationalized every escalation, every betrayal, every act of violence as serving a greater good visible only to him. Each step deeper into darkness followed logically from the last. In May 2007, the novel Sacrifice delivered the defining act. Jacen murdered Mara Jade Skywalker, his aunt, his mentor, Luke Skywalker's wife, to complete his ascension to Sith Lord. Mara Jade, introduced by Zahn in 1991 as the Emperor's Hand, had traveled one of the EU's great narrative arcs, from would-be assassin of Luke Skywalker to his wife and partner. She was arguably the most beloved original character the EU had ever produced. For Jacen to kill her was for the EU to destroy something its readers cherished in service of a story about how good people become monsters. That emotional payload required decades of character investment to detonate. A single film couldn't manufacture it. A trilogy couldn't either. Jacen's arc ended in May 2008 with the novel Invincible. His twin sister Jaina killed him. She'd trained specifically for this, accepting that the boy she'd shared a womb with, grown up alongside, and fought beside in a galactic war was beyond saving. Readers who met Jacen as an unborn child in 1991 watched his twin end his life in 2008. 17 years of real-world publishing. A generation of accumulated storytelling, earned page by page. Now compare. Disney gave us Kylo Ren, Ben Solo. His fall to the dark side happened off-screen, somewhere between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. No build-up across decades of publishing. No philosophical crisis readers followed from adolescence into adulthood. No specific trauma traced with patience through multiple series. A character who arrived already fallen, whose story across the sequel trilogy covered narrative ground that the EU had explored across dozens of novels, with exponentially more depth. Jacen Solo's tragedy worked because readers had known him since before he was born. Kylo Ren's tragedy was told to the audience. A single flashback where a story should have been. A PowerPoint summary where the EU had given a lived experience. The Yuzon Vong invasion deserves its own testimony beyond its role in Jacen's story. 19 novels across 4 years by multiple authors working within a shared framework. A genuine serialized war narrative tracking an alien invasion from initial incursions at the galaxy's edge to the fall of Coruscant itself. The Yuzon Vong broke every assumption Star Wars audiences had held since 1977. Organic biotechnology instead of machines. Pain worshipped as religious sacrament. They existed outside the Force, meaning the Jedi couldn't sense them, couldn't predict them. couldn't rely on the metaphysical framework that had governed the franchise for decades. Coruscant, the galactic capital, the seat of civilization for millennia, was overrun and reshaped by alien terraforming into something grotesque and unrecognizable. No convenient superweapon to destroy, no single decisive battle to win, just attritional apocalypse that stripped away everything familiar, killed beloved characters, and left the galaxy permanently scarred when it finally ended. 19 volumes proved Star Wars could handle genuine, irreversible consequences at epic scale. Disney replaced all of it with the First Order, an unexplained Imperial resurgence that reset the galaxy back to Rebels versus Empire with no coherent explanation of how the New Republic collapsed. The sequel trilogy didn't just ignore the EU's answer to what happened after Endor. It refused to offer a credible answer of its own. The Abaloth crisis cuts deepest of the three, because the 2014 canon wipe interrupted it mid-story. Abaloth was the primary antagonist of Fate of the Jedi, 9 novels published between March 2009 and April 2012 by Aaron Alston, Christy Golden, and Troy Denning. An entity of immense force power, connected to the Mortis Arc and the Ones, primordial force wielders that the Clone Wars animated series had introduced. Abaloth predated the Sith, predated the Jedi, possibly predated the galaxy. 9 books built her menace, layering revelation upon revelation about her origins, her hunger, her dominion over the living force. Fate of the Jedi concluded with Apocalypse in April 2012, and the ending deliberately left Abaloth's ultimate fate ambiguous. That ambiguity was designed as a narrative bridge, a cliffhanger meant to fuel future books and series. Plans existed, outlines were drafted, authors were gearing up. 6 months later, Disney acquired Lucasfilm. The Abaloth cliffhanger, designed as a bridge to stories still coming, became a tombstone instead. Apocalypse was published just 6 months before the acquisition, meaning the 2014 canon wipe permanently froze the cliffhanger in amber. A completed story being decanonized insults its readers. An unfinished story being abandoned breaks a promise. One fan described the unresolved Abaloth arc with surgical precision. It still hurts. That pain lives in the specificity. Not a story ended, but a story stopped. Through all of this, the sequel trilogy offered Luke Skywalker as a hermit on an island who'd abandoned the galaxy. The EU's Luke built a Jedi Academy, married Mara Jade, raised a son, fought in multiple galactic crises, and remained the moral center of the franchise across decades of publishing. The sequel trilogy's characterization downgraded a richer, more fully realized version of the character that already existed in thousands of pages of published fiction. This same pattern held everywhere. The EU's complex New Republic replaced by an inexplicable First Order. Mara Jade erased entirely, her character arc vaporized. Decades of post-Endor history swapped for a narrative that reset the board to 1977 and called it innovation. So how did fans respond to the Legends decree? They ignored it. The community that grew up reading the EU didn't accept the rebranding. Fans launched hashtag campaigns. Petitions circulated. Legends-branded novels continued to sell, sustained by community evangelism and the stubborn reality that good stories don't expire because a press release says they're unofficial. Fan wikis maintained full Legends continuity with meticulous devotion, documenting every character, every timeline entry, every cross-reference, with the dedication of archivists preserving manuscripts from a collapsing civilization. An entire parallel fandom persisted, treating the expanded universe as the true post-Return of the Jedi canon, regardless of what any corporate press release said. And the most telling evidence that Disney knows the EU carries gravitational pull they can't escape. They keep reaching back into it. Grand Admiral Thrawn was brought into the Rebels animated series, and later into live action with Ahsoka. Persistent rumors of Mara Jade's potential reintroduction into canon have surfaced. Plot elements, character types, and narrative structures from the EU keep getting quietly recanonized, piece by piece, because the corporation that declared these stories apocryphal can't stop mining them for material. Every recanonized element is an admission. Every borrowed character is a receipt. That April 2014 announcement tried to draw a line. Official canon on one side, legends on the other. But canon has never been something a press release bestows. Canon is what the audience carries with them after the last page turns, after the last credit rolls. Millions of readers spent decades inside the expanded universe. They grew up with Jacen and Jaina Solo. They mourned Chewbacca on Cernpadal, and Anakin Solo during a desperate strike mission against the Yuzon Vong. They followed Mara Jade from assassin to wife and partner to murder victim. They waited for Abeloth's return, and they're still waiting, because no one was ever allowed to write the next chapter. Those stories live in the community, in the books still being bought and read and argued about, in the fact that Disney keeps reaching back into the material they declared dead because they can't build anything better. 37 years of storytelling, from 1977 to the canon wipe in 2014. Thousands of pages of novels, hundreds of comics, video games that built their own mythologies within the shared timeline. A universe maintained by a dedicated continuity database, constructed by hundreds of creators and sustained by millions of readers who invested real decades of their lives in these characters. Disney looked at all of it and said it didn't count. The fans looked right back and said, "Make something better first." They're still waiting. Subscribe for more stories like this.